This is the 12th video from It Can Happen Here, a nonpartisan organization dedicated to protecting the personal freedoms guaranteed to Americans by the Bill of Rights. In these videos, we've been exploring the claims that Donald Trump, the Republican presidential candidate in 2024, wants to be a fascist dictator. In our first 10 videos, we started by defining fascism and then examined the effect a fascist dictatorship would have on the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. Sadly, we concluded that if Donald Trump did become an American fascist dictator, we would almost certainly lose those precious freedoms. In our most recent video, we studied the evidence that Trump wants to be a fascist dictator, reluctantly concluding it's likely he harbors that dangerous ambition. Today we're discussing the final barriers protecting the Bill of Rights from authoritarianism, the Constitution, and the democratic institutions established thereunder. Vladimir Putin in Russia, Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines, Recep Erdogan in Turkey, and Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela all managed to subvert pre-existing democratic institutions in their respective countries to create personal autocracies. In most cases, the dictators preserve the appearance, if not the reality, of democratic government. We presume that Donald Trump or another aspiring American dictator would follow a similar path. It may seem improbable today that an American president could follow the example of Venezuela's Maduro, who in 2024 used his office to falsify election results so he could stay in power. Relying on the support of Venezuela's military, Maduro has simply ignored international demands for him to step down in favor of the real electoral winner. In the U.S., as illustrated by Trump's unsuccessful efforts to persuade Georgia officials to find a few votes in 2020, the president has little control over elections, which are conducted by state and local election officials. However, Trump supporters in Congress are trying to enact laws creating more federal control over elections, disingenuously citing Trump's false claims of election fraud in 2020. If Congress does give the president control over election administration, there is a substantial risk that an incumbent president like Trump would follow Maduro's lead and simply declare, falsely, that he won re-election. Imagining Trump's re-election in 2028 leads one to consider the 22nd Amendment and its prohibition of anyone being elected president more than twice. Many assume that the 22nd Amendment would stop Trump from running for re-election in 2028 if he wins in 2024. History might suggest otherwise. In 2008, when Vladimir Putin was barred from a third consecutive term as president by the Russian Constitution, he simply worked around it. Putin caused his chosen candidate, Dmitry Medvedev, to be elected president. Medvedev immediately appointed Putin as Prime Minister of Russia, from which position Putin continued his authoritarian rule without skipping a beat. The Russian Constitution was later amended to permit Putin to serve additional terms as president. His current term expires in 2030. The 22nd Amendment can be evaded by maneuvers similar to Putin's gambit in 2008, such as Trump nominally running for vice president behind a presidential candidate who has pledged loyalty to Trump. If Trump does win in 2024, we should assume that he could stay in power indefinitely by following Putin's example. In Turkey, Recep Erdogan was first elected president in 2014. 3 years later, Erdogan pushed through a nationwide referendum that changed the constitution to give him authoritarian powers. He got control of the judiciary, the right to serve 2 additional 5-year terms, the power to make laws by decree, and the diminishment of Turkey's parliamentary system to near irrelevance. In the United States, amending the Constitution is much more difficult than winning a national referendum. Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution requires the approval of 37 state legislatures, an extremely difficult benchmark in our politically polarized country. A workaround might involve proposing an amendment that makes it easier to amend the Constitution, such as by a national referendum. If such an amendment seems reasonable enough to gather bipartisan support across the country, it could later be used to abrogate the Bill of Rights and other Constitution protections. The constitutional limits of a presidency have also been avoided by declaring martial law. In 1972, Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos evaded a constitutional limit on his term in office by declaring martial law. For the next 14 years, he ruled as a vicious dictator, imprisoning, torturing, and killing thousands of political enemies before fleeing the country in 1986. Martial law is essentially a declaration of military law that is, at least arguably, not subject to constraint by the courts. The U.S. Constitution contemplates a declaration of martial law only in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. While constitutional scholars disagree about whether the president has constitutional power to invoke martial law without the consent of Congress, the National Insurrection Act passed by Congress authorizes the president to call out the U.S. Armed Forces and the National Guard first to oppose an insurrection against any state if requested by the state, or second, to oppose an insurrection that makes it impracticable to enforce the law, or third, to oppose an insurrection, domestic violence, or an unlawful conspiracy that deprives constitutional rights if the state doesn't protect those rights. There's plenty of vague language there if a president is looking for an excuse to impose martial law. During the Capitol Hill riot on January 6, 2021, some feared that then-President Trump would invoke the National Insurrection Act to declare martial law as a subterfuge to delay or evade the transfer of power to Joe Biden on January 20th. Some also believed that Trump purposefully delayed stopping his followers on January 6th in order to justify a planned invocation of the Insurrection Act, but Trump never did so. In sum, the recent history in other countries like Russia, Turkey, Venezuela, and the Philippines confirms that aspiring dictators can evade the restrictions of a constitution and other democratic institutions to seize power. Many believe that the United States already came frighteningly close to a fascist dictatorship on January 6th. Some also contend that after the Supreme Court's recent decision granting broad immunity to the president when executing official duties, if there is another violent uprising like January 6th, Trump would find it much easier to seize authoritarian powers now than in 2021. In our 12 videos, we have dispassionately examined a number of complex issues. What constitutes fascism? The likely demise of the freedoms contained in the Bill of Rights if a fascist dictatorship takes hold, the likelihood that Donald Trump aspires to be a fascist dictator, and today, the substantial risk that Trump could succeed if he did seek authoritarian rule. As guardians of the rights and freedoms of the Bill of Rights, we therefore conclude Donald Trump should not be elected President of the United States in 2024 or at any other time. Our opposition to Donald Trump has nothing to do with his political positions or those of his opponent. To the contrary, our position is predicated entirely on protecting America from the nightmare of fascism and the loss of our freedoms that comes with it. We acknowledge the argument that Trump might never become a dictator. It is obviously impossible to know the future. However, based on the evidence we have so carefully reviewed, we believe it would be foolish to accept Trump's half-hearted denials of dictatorial ambition when the Bill of Rights is at stake. Like Pascal's wager, the loss that we risk is far too great to take a chance on the honesty of Donald Trump. Our next video will be the last in this series on the threat of fascism to the Bill of Rights. For those who are persuaded that Donald Trump poses too great of a risk to our American freedoms, it will be a practical guide for what you can do to stop a Trump-led fascist dictatorship.